Thank you guys for being here. Real quick, have to do an antitrust advisory whenever we do this. Any examples we give, I'll try to use X%, Y%. We don't want to talk about actual percentages when we're a group of competitors because we don't price fix. Commissions are negotiable. Everyone can set their own price. We don't want any misunderstandings, even if we're giving examples. Personal disclaimer, I think you guys know I am a licensed attorney, but I'm not your attorney. I'm not Compass's attorney. I'm a sales manager for Compass. I'm a director of the Newport Board, the Laguna Board of Realtors, CAR. I'm not in here in the capacity of any of them. If I say something stupid, it's totally on me. It's not on them. Today's an overview of what's coming. A lot is changing. So we're going to do an overview. I'm going to try not to get in the weeds too far, which I'm really bad about not doing. I want to start with a dangerous misconception about August 17th. You guys have heard that date, right? August 17th, that's when the NAR rules go into effect and all that. The truth is actually that all the new rules are already going to be in effect by August 17th. So working backwards, August 13th, that's the date that CRMLS is taking the compensation out of the MLS. So that's happening before the 17th anyway. July 1st, that's when the new law regarding security deposits goes into effect, that you're only going to be able to get 1 month security deposit unless it's a small landlord, and there's an exception to that exemption. We'll talk about it if we have time at the end. The middle of next month, in June, that's when the 67 new or revised CAR forms come out. And those forms embody most of the NAR changes. So in practice, you guys are going to be dealing with the new rules and the new reality of your profession way before August 17th. That's when the new listing agreement comes out. This is mid-June. New listing agreement, new broker-buyer agreement, revised purchase agreement, and all the other forms that you're going to need to know about and how to use. So even before that, tomorrow, May 29th, have you guys heard what's coming tomorrow?
No.
No? Yes?
No. Yeah, concessions.
Yeah. Concessions. So I know this is going to be a kind of a forms, CAR, new revised forms, but because things are fluid and I want to keep you guys up to date, tomorrow CRMLS adds concessions into the MLS as a forward-facing field in addition to the concessions we know. So we know concessions as they are now when you close escrow, if the seller gave credits to the buyer. So the concessions that we know are when the seller gives a concession to buyers, like for repairs, closing costs, or the buyer's agents reducing their commission. And we enter that when we close the sale so that when we look at the comps later, we know the effective purchase price. This new concessions field is entirely different. This is forward-facing. So this is money that the seller is offering to the buyer right up front. That seller's saying, buyer, here's a chunk of money. Use it for repairs. Use it to pay your agent. Use it to just incentivize you to unlock my equity. I don't care what you use it for, but this is seller offering money to the buyer. So CRMLS has this FAQ out, which I'm going to hit some of the high points so we all understand. That concessions are monetary contributions or credits from the seller towards the buyer's cost in the transaction. They can be escrow or title fees, lender fees, loan discount points, that's the seller buying down the rate of the buyer's loan, property improvements. MLS uses improvements in not just repairs, because they say every repair is an improvement to the property. So just know repairs is like improvements. Broker fees, that's the commission, can be used for commission, and other recurring or non-recurring costs. So when are these fields being added? I said tomorrow. That's why we're talking about it today. What are they going to look like? So there's going to be a field for concession in price, and this is the numerical input. This is the amount of percentage or dollar that the seller is offering to the buyer. Again, note this is seller to the buyer, not to buyer's broker. This is for the buyer to do what they want to. So there's going to be a numerical value, and there's also going to be the price type, either dollar or percent. If the seller's not sure how much they want to offer to the buyer, they just know that they do, they can check a box of yes or no, and if yes is checked, this phrase is going to pop up on the MLS automatically that says a seller may consider a buyer concession if made an offer. You make a good offer with good terms, I may give you some money. If your offer sucks, I may not give you any money. We'll see. It's totally negotiable. And it's also totally optional. These concessions are not mandatory by any means, and they cannot be earmarked specifically for compensation. So even though a buyer can use it to pay their agent, The seller cannot condition offering this money to the buyer on the fact that they will use it to pay their agent. So just know that it can be used to pay commissions, but the seller cannot condition payment on it being used for commissions. So how is it different? Like I said, we have that back-facing concessions field now that's mandatory if the seller gave a buyer a credit. That will still exist. This is an entirely different forward-facing concessions field. Is it binding in the sense that if the seller's offering this money and the buyer writes an offer that gets accepted, does the seller have to give him that money? Not just because it's offered in the MLS, they have to agree to the terms in the offer for that money. And I'll show the RPA in a second just to show where that's going to be. And this is what it's going to look like in Matrix. You guys all use Matrix, right? Not Paragon or Flex or something else. Okay. So this is what it's going to look like when you input it into Matrix. So how does a buyer collect on this offer of concession? In the RPA, the grid, the top of page 2, 3G1, you have the seller credit, if any, to buyer. So this is where if the buyer wants to capitalize on the credits or concessions being offered by the seller in the MLS, buyer should write this into the offer. Say, I saw that you're offering up to this amount. I want to ask for this amount. So that goes into this field that we're used to already. Don't confuse this, though, with 3G3. So paragraph 3G3, which is still the most confusing clause in the RPA, this is the buyer asking the seller to pay the buyer's agent because the buyer has a BRBC, the broker buyer compensation agreement, with the buyer for X amount. The buyer's going to pay their agent X amount, and the buyer's asking the seller, hey, seller, will you pay some or all of this obligation? So this 3G3 is seller to the buyer's broker or the buyer's agent, different from 3G1 of the seller paying the buyer a concession or a credit. So hopefully that's understood. Still, a little murky question.
So in the G1 that you're talking about in the last column, I'm hearing you say do not check other input real estate commissions or buyer's agent commissions. Don't do that.
So no, my understanding is it could be. You could check for commission. Now you don't need to because it can just be for whatever the buyer wants. But the seller cannot condition. The seller can't dictate this must be used for commissions. The buyer can say, hey, I want to use my for commission. But the better way to do that, though, would be to use 3G3 that says I have an obligation to pay my buyer or my buyer's agent. Seller, will you offset some or all of that amount with this money? And now let me go through a couple of the other changes in the RPA that you're going to see when this comes out next month. Probably the biggest one is that insurance is going to be a separate contingency entirely. Because right now, insurance, the buyer's ability to get it and pay for it is under what contingency? Investigation contingency, the broader one. Sierra has pulled this out and made it a separate contingency all by itself, which I think is a good thing. So you'll see in the revised contingency removal form and the revised notice to buyer to perform, it will also separate out insurance separate from the investigation contingency. They've noted that this Fortress wildfire disclosure is optional, and they added in a couple more lines for reports here, because when they added the wildfire disclosure, they only left one line for any other reports. Okay, a couple other RPA things before we move on, because this ties in with some of the other stuff. Balconies, exterior stairways, other elevated elements. You guys know there's a new law coming into effect that's going to require the seller to inspect certain elements, like the raised balcony stairways more than 6 feet if it's wood-based, and if there's 3 or more units. So that's why that's in here to address that. And of course, CAR has a separate form for that if that is incorporated into the purchase. Okay, this ties in with the new stuff. In the ABCD form now, that's the one where as the buyer's agent, you're telling the buyer all of the offers of compensation on the things we're going to see, so they know what gets offset. At the bottom of the current form, there's a spot that the buyer's agent is supposed to fill out at the close of escrow to say, hey buyer, this is exactly how much I got paid, and this is exactly who paid me. And we talked to CAR and we're like, that's a pain in the butt, let's not do that. CAR said, we'll make escrow do it. So the new RPA says escrow holder shall provide to buyer and seller a closing statement or written documentation showing the amount of compensation paid to buyer's broker and seller's broker. So you don't have to do that anymore as the agent, which I think is a good thing for all of us. We're losing a form. The Fair Appraisal Act addendum that gets bundled, that's required by law, CAR realized, why don't we just put that into the RPA instead of having a separate form? So that's this entire section replaces that form because that's required by law. Now this whole section is left intentionally blank. Bad news is that's because they're going to add more stuff eventually. So now it's 17 pages. But that's also to keep all the signatures for the buyer and the seller on one page and all the signatures for each agent and brokers on one page. Which brings us to the last page, the designated electronic delivery address. This default is a big deal if you're not aware of it. So the definition of delivery, when the other agent sends you documents, which may be time sensitive, which may start the time ticking for certain things, if you send it to this designated electronic delivery address, it's deemed delivered and time starts running whether the other agent opened it, saw it, or even knows it's in the inbox. On the last form, you had to check a box to initiate your designated electronic delivery address. Now it just defaults to the email above. So you need to make sure that this email is what you want to be the email you check, and that deadlines start running when the other agent sends you emails during the transaction. You can write a different email here, or you can attach the DEDA form that will change it. And there's actually an opt-out check on that form to say, I don't want anything deemed delivered even if you email it to me. You have to verify that I actually got it, which is the way that we used to do it. So that is an option few people are going to do because few people know this form exists because they don't even know that this changed. But you guys do. Okay, so those are the changes in the RPA. Let's talk about a new form you're all going to be seeing a lot of as I click through 18 different things here. The BCA, the Broker Compensation Advisory. This form gets bundled with the BRBC, the Buyer Representation Broker Compensation, your broker-buyer agreement. It's also going to be bundled with the listing agreement. Agents have asked for like a one sheet or a cheat sheet. How do I explain to my clients what's going on, how commissions are paid, what the options are? CAR did the heavy lifting for you and wrote this language that you can just use with your clients. So a great form to read and know. I know very few agents are going to read it. Why? Because there's nothing to fill out. It's just something that gets bundled with the forms and the client signs. But this is a great cheat sheet for all of you guys because of the language in there. We're not going to go through it line by line, but just know that the first paragraph has to do with the sellers and offering compensation. The second line has to do with the buyers and compensation. And the third is how buyers agents or buyers brokers get paid. The last time I was here, we talked about the few ways buyers agents can get paid. Well, one, it's only through the buyer broker. I'm not going through that again, but you guys know what I mean. So 3 different entities that can pay the buyer is 1, the buyer themselves, 2 is the seller, and 3 is the listing broker, and what forms we use to make that happen. So in a nutshell, number 1 is the buyer can be paid, or the buyer's agent can be paid by the buyer through the BRBC. So that's that form. 2 is that the seller can pay it either through the SPBB that we talked about in the RPA of the buyer saying, hey, seller, will you pay my obligation to pay my broker? Buyer's agent can get paid from the seller that way. Or a buyer's agent can negotiate directly with an unrepresented seller like a FSBO. You'll use the single party compensation agreement. And then the last way is the way we're used to it now is the seller's agent paying compensation to the buyer's agent. So right now that's through the MLS. That's going to be going away. So what form are we going to use for the listing broker to pay the buyer's broker? Is the CBC. We use it now for off-market sales or when you're modifying or confirming compensation in the MLS. This CBC form is going to be super important. It's going to be the new PED form. It's going to be a huge pain in the ass. But as a buyer's agent, this is how you're going to confirm what you're being paid if the seller's broker is offering compensation. Because right now, the offer of compensation through the MLS is a binding offer. When you send an offer, you accept that offer of compensation, the listing broker has to pay it. But for now, listing brokers can still offer compensation to buyer's brokers outside the MLS. So that's on your website, on a flyer, word of mouth, marketing meeting like here. But as a buyer's agent, you want to nail that down contractually through a form like the CBC because they could tell you it's X%, you send the offer, and then tomorrow they say, oh, I'm only paying Y, I'm paying less than that. That was yesterday's price. So you're going to want to use the CBC to nail that down. Question?
Okay, so that goes totally to the broker's, buyer broker's agent, not to
Correct. The CBC. The CBC. The gist of the question is this is from listing broker to buyer's broker. It's not seller to buyer. It's not seller to buyer's broker. This is listing broker to buyer's broker. The CBC is between brokers. So that's why in that BCA, it's important to understand the moving parts of who is paying who's offering compensation, and how things get offset. Because there's a lot more moving parts now than there were before. So great clarification. This form has greatly been simplified from 2 pages down to 1 because the current form has all sorts of lines for modifying compensation in the MLS, confirming compensation in the MLS, no offer compensation in the MLS. Well, compensation through the MLS is going away entirely. So it's simplified down to just offer regarding compensation. The seller's broker agrees to pay the buyer's broker compensation in the amount of fill in the blank. Now, I'm hoping they add an expiration date to this because the CBC currently doesn't have an expiration. And there have been situations where a buyer's agent had a CBC sign with the listing broker. They didn't put the deal together, and that buyer went to a different agent who then had a CBC signed. They put the deal together, it closed, and buyer's agent number 1 showed up and said, listing broker, you told me if this buyer buys it, you're paying me. If there was an expiration in there, it would have solved that problem. Question?
Now, when you sign a buyer-broker agreement, will it be able to go on the MLS?
If you sign a buyer-broker agreement, will it go in the MLS? Or the...
The seller agent paying for the buyer's broker, does it go on the agent under a certain area?
No,
They have to call you.
correct. So if the seller's going to pay the buyer's agent through that SPBB, then no. That doesn't go in the MLS. So the seller will be able to offer concessions to the buyer that a buyer could use for that, but it still needs to be in the purchase agreement and negotiated.
But if you sign that agreement,
Which agreement?
that one that you have up there,
Oh, the CBC?
CBC,
Yeah.
you can't put it in agent remarks or anything like that?
No, MLS cannot have anything to do with seller's broker offering compensation to a buyer's broker. Can't be in private remarks, cannot say call me for compensation. You can't allude to it whatsoever, which doesn't make sense because you can put on your flyer, you can call them and you can tell them, it just can't be in the MLS. So if I had to speculate, I think the DOJ wants compensation being paid from a listing broker to a buyer's broker to go away, period. On MLS, off MLS. Frankly, my unpopular opinion is it would simplify a lot of things. It would take a lot of these moving parts out of play. It would be offered concessions to the buyer. Buyer, you pay your agent. Yeah.
Under the new concession box that's going to be forward, the seller decides that they're going to offer compensation of X. Do we see that as an agent going into the MLS? Do we see that, or is that?
Yeah, so the new concessions where seller is offering to pay buyer X. Not only do buyer's agents see it, CR MLS told me this will be on the IDX feed going out to buyers too, which makes sense. If a seller's offering it to the buyer should know what's being offered.
So it will show up on.
Yes,
Zillow's
public
report,
facing,
right?
yeah, public facing sites.
Some kind of a concession box on the aggregate site.
Yeah. And my understanding is that's the whole point of transparency. Seller is offering this to the buyer. Why wouldn't it be public for the buyer to see what the seller is offering?
If it's in the listing agreement, put it in the MLS as a listing agent. Is it binding? Can the seller change their mind?
No. Is it binding? So if the seller puts an offer of concession to the buyer, it is not binding.
So it can change
It's an
the
offer. Yes, depending on the offer, it's negotiable. Yep. It is not binding whatsoever. Question?
Just want to offer clarity. This form is to confirm all of these questions. So this form, you can use it to confirm this form. This is to this is to confirm what you're getting paid. So that it's kind of the answer to these questions of is it in the MLS? Is it not in that? This is the answer to that question to confirm your compensation because it's not binding in the listing agreement.
Well, okay, yes. So the CBC confirms the offer of compensation from listing broker to the buyer's broker, which is not in the MLS whatsoever. Now the concession being offered gets confirmed in the RPA because that's between buyer and seller. Seller's offering buyer money, and the RPA is an agreement between buyer and seller. The CBC does not appear in the RPA, and it does not appear in the MLS. This is outside of that. Yes.
Isn't that more confusing to the buyer?
Yes, that's what I just said.
Is it more confusing to the buyer? Yes, probably, and that's why you all are going to explain all of this to your clients. Because it is confusing. Yeah.
Where's that attorney that made this? Yeah.
So, no, the attorneys don't make these forms. Actually, it's a standard forms committee that get reviewed by attorneys.
The lawsuit that happened, right? That's
Yeah.
No, this form has been around for decades.
The CBC's been around a long time. But the rule changes, yes. Are the rule changes better for the public? Is it less confusing? Maybe, maybe not. But, and that's why I say it, my understanding is the DOJ wants the compensation to go away entirely, being offered from listing broker to buyer's broker, and that would probably simplify it because you'd remove those moving parts entirely. Is it more confusing? Yeah, and it will be. Is it more transparent? Yes. If it's explained right, yes, it is. Because
Only behind scenes, when you're with your buyer, but not out in the open. Which is supposed to be transparent.
but right.
Everyone else.
So the transparency, now the buyers are going to see what is being offered, and
Afterwards. But not
no, they'll see that on websites everywhere through the IDX feed that the seller is offering up to a certain amount of concessions to the buyer. Now, what's the listing broker is offering to the buyer's broker,
Not when they sign the CBC. That's
the client doesn't sign the CBC. This is between broker to broker. So where the transparency is broker to broker is through the ABCD form, which is referenced in the broker-buyer agreement that says, before I write an offer for you as my buyer, I am going to disclose what's being offered by anybody else. In fact, let me pull that up while we're talking about it, because it will probably make more sense. The current broker-buyer agreement, the default is that you have to give it to the buyer before you write an offer, or you can check a box that says before I even show you property, which I think that makes sense. Buyers are going to want to know. The new version says as soon as practicable before writing the offer. So the ABCD form is this big grid that says, hey, buyer, you know you've committed to pay me X%. These are all the things I'm going to show you, and this is what is being offered on each of these listings and who is offering it. So the buyer can get their head around, if I buy this one, I pay you out of pocket this much. If I buy that one, it's entirely offset by what is being offered. So it's part of the transparency. There's more moving parts, but it does lead to more transparency.
So every time you're showing property,
Every time you're showing property. Well, okay, let me back up. The default is before you write an offer, you have to give this. My personal feeling is you should want your buyer to know. And your buyer's going to want to know. You don't want to get into escrow or write an offer where the buyer says, I love this property, this is great. Let's write an offer, and then they find out, oh, I've got to pay you out of pocket, and I can't pay you. So now we have to negotiate either through the SPBB or some other way, and I really want the property. But now I know I can't actually pay my agent for it. So that's why I think before you even show property, and even maybe at the buyer consultation, when you're explaining to the buyer how all of this works in the new world with compensation. And I'm asking you to sign a broker-buyer agreement because I have to now, because we're past August 17th, before I work with you, we have to sign this. I'm worth X%, you're committing to that. But look at everything in the price range you're looking at. This is what's being offset, so you have an idea of what you're going to come out of pocket
But it's not
to
for
pay.
sure, because the seller could go back and change.
It's not for sure, exactly. And that's part of the complication with the CBC. You're going to want to nail that down.
So you're giving them this, and you're going, baby.
Yeah, it's potential.
well, the CBC is mentioned in this form, right, to confirm the compensation.
So yeah, the CBC would be the seller's broker in the source. And I think your buyer's going to say, hey, before we see this property, get your CBC signed, because I want to know. I don't want the listing broker to pull the rug out from under you because I don't want to pay any more out of pocket than I have to. Question?
Oh, okay. At some point, there will be amendment on those prices depending on the part of the contract negotiation.
Well, at some point there will be what?
Amendment or negotiation or amendment.
Yeah,
Commitment.
a commitment.
Commitment.
hmm
Yeah.
Well, between buyer and seller. But if you write an offer and you don't have a CBC nailed down, there may not be a commitment from the listing broker to pay the buyer's broker. So the buyer will have to come out of pocket because the buyer will have to have the broker-buyer agreement signed under the new rules of NAR. So that's what the buyers are going to want to know.
Like there's a condition of the property that there's something wrong with the property, and then the seller would say, okay, I would agree on this price, but I will pay this amount. Because sometimes they
Correct. That's why it's an offer of compensation. Yeah. Depending on what your offer is, I will give you, buyer, this amount of money. You get an escrow, buyer does a repair request, and they say, I want this extra chunk of money. Seller can say, I already gave you money at the beginning. You can use it to pay your agent, use it for repairs, use it for whatever you want. So because I already gave you money. But the seller could give more if they want, but they've already negotiated that up front. Yeah.
Where's the, on the CBC, the expiration?
No, there is not an expiration on the CBC as of now. I'm hoping they add that in, but there's not. So you could do an addendum to the CBC saying this expires on this date.
Buyer agent never do an expiration because if I can't somebody go, like you said on the other one, they went with another agent who wrote up the offer. They're not going to do an expiration.
Buyer's agent may not want it. Listing broker may want it. So we'll see if they add that in. I mean, that's part of discussions.
Contradictions in the forms where I'm reading them wrong. On one form it says concession, and this one says compensation.
Correct. The difference between concession and compensation. Compensation in the CBC is broker to broker. Concession is seller to buyer.
But if we use the ABCD form in that body, it says compensation. If you scroll down,
Right. Here in the red, the buyer is aware that any compensation paid by seller directly or indirectly through seller's broker affects seller's total cost, may impact the price seller's willing to impact. So, right. No, it is. It's confusing. And that red is a new addition to the ABCD. So that's a term that they kicked around because it may have said compensation, may have said commission, may have said, right. Yep.
So this whole lawsuit came about because of steering buyers, right? They accused us as steering buyers for higher commissions. Okay, now if the buyers are aware of what concession is being offered, that's going to steer them as well.
So yeah, steering, and that the concern that buyers were steering, or buyers agents were steering their buyers to different properties based on this. So it brings up a good question. If a buyer looks at the ABCD form and says, I don't want to see any of those that aren't offering compensation because I can't pay for it. One NAR attorney said you're not allowed to not show them that property. CAR attorneys and other attorneys I talked to said that makes no sense. You have to show a buyer property they are telling you they don't want to see. So there's, I know, conflicting right now, my opinion, and it's not CAR's opinion, not Compass's opinion, not NAR's opinion, not Irene's opinion, is that would be perfectly fine. If a buyer says, don't show me these properties, you don't have to show them those properties because they can't pay for it. Because I know we're in the weeds and I got to pull my head up to look at the new listing agreement that's going to address a lot of these questions. And then we're going to get back down in the weeds with the
But we all know
RLA.
that commission never chose what property our buyers were going to buy. I mean, they could see those properties online.
Right.
And like I said, now this is going to really affect them because if they can't pay the commission.
Correct. If they can't pay their agent commission, but they should know what's being offered. So the new listing agreement is going to be a grid form. All the red is new. So you see it's totally being overhauled. We'll have a whole another class on the listing agreement. But so this gets to a couple of points you just made is in the listing agreement. Oh, hang on. Let me jump to the broker buyer agreement first. Sorry, the sidetrack, because this was your first point. In the broker buyer agreement, you'll see it's a grid. It's all red. And we'll do a whole nother class on that. But you see the buyer financial personal information. There's a box to check for the buyer saying, I don't have sufficient funds to pay you. I've committed to pay you this amount, and I'm telling you now, I cannot pay you. You need to negotiate that with the buyer's or seller's broker through the CBC, or we have to negotiate this through the SPBB in the offer, because I'm telling you now, I can't afford to pay what I want to pay you. So it's more options, but a buyer, if they say, don't show me those properties, I don't want to see it, you don't have to show them the properties. in that BCA, the Broker Compensation Advisory, there's talking points for your seller to talk to the seller to say, if you don't offer compensation, commission, whatever, concession, any of those C words, you may shrink your buyer pool. There may be buyers out there that say, I want to buy your house. I cannot afford to pay my agent. Where if, as a seller, you bake that into your price, you either pay your broker more to offer it to other brokers, or you offer concessions to the buyer, you're going to increase your buyer pool because more buyers will be able to buy your property because of that, because of how this works out. So that's in the BRBC. Looking at the listing agreement, this is going to be super important. This is where agents' heads start to explode.
Start? Okay.
Yep. If your head hasn't exploded yet, it will when you see the listing agreement, but it makes a lot of sense. And it pushes a lot of conversations that you have with your seller when the offers come in right to the front of the listing appointment, because it uncouples the total compensation being paid and then what's being offered to the buyer's broker. Because the listing agreement right now says total compensation to me as a listing broker, X, and I will offer to a buyer's broker Y through the MLS. That's going to have to go away, and different negotiations come up when different situations arise. So the new listing agreement addresses this. Because of the draft form, I can't highlight the C1, but if you see where my cursor is, this C1 compensation to seller's broker, only the seller side of the transaction. This is the percent of the listing price or dollar amount that the listing agent makes. Cut and dry, that's it. I'm your listing agent, this is what I'm being paid. Don't worry about what's being offered to anybody else. If you want to do it the traditional way, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, you check the box for C2, optional additional compensation, if any, to seller's broker to be offered to buyer's brokers. That's kind of what we see now, is do you want me to offer to buyer's brokers off of MLS compensation? We're going to add that amount here.
C2 4B, do we put that in concessions?
No, we don't put that in concessions. We'll come to that. Here's a sneak peek. Look down at D. Optional seller concessions. So C2, which references 4B in the grid, this doesn't go in the MLS. This cannot go in the MLS. This offer a compensation from listing broker to buyer's broker cannot be in the MLS. And there's another form for listing. No, this is actually good. For listing agreements that are in effect now that don't sell before August 17th. That says, hey seller, because of these new NAR rules, I can't offer compensation through the MLS to buyer's brokers. Our listing agreement says I'm going to offer commission to buyer's brokers through the MLS. So we need to change that. I'm going to be doing it off of MLS, and that satisfies my obligation to you as the seller. And I'm going to tell you when these new rules go into effect, which we know now is August 13th for the CRMLS, the commission to be out of the MLS. Disclosure and modification to listing agreement, the DM-LA, and this is great to explain to your sellers. Hey, NAR has entered into the settlement. One of the terms is that can't use the MLS anymore to offer compensation. Broker agrees to notify seller once the MLS will no longer be able to do this. If you have listings now, tell your sellers now, August 13th. We know when that is. Hang on, I'll come to you. Broker also agrees to notify seller the method and means you're going to use to offer that. Flyers, social media, word of mouth, marketing meetings. And seller agrees that the broker's reasonable efforts in place of the MLS offer compensation will satisfy broker's obligations under the listing agreement. All other terms remain the same. Simple, you're not filling anything out on this form. You're just saying, hey seller, we can't offer it through the MLS anymore. I'm going to do it these other ways, and you're good with that.
So obviously, if we submit a full price offer or close to list, we should check the box asking the seller to pay the compensation, correct?
If you submit a full price offer,
Yeah.
should you check the box for the SP or the credits saying we want this whole thing? It's a discussion with your buyer depending on the market you're in. Let's say the buyer says, I really want this property. There's multiple offers. I'll write full price. Seller, you don't have to pay me all you're offering because I want the house. I don't need the money. Totally negotiable. Totally depends on the circumstance. Yeah.
How many TCs are in the room?
How many TCs are in the room? There were more. Their heads exploded.
It's going to be on you to help us.
No, it's not on the TCs. Thank you for bringing that up. There's been too much reliance on TCs, and that's part of the problem I have with the forms and the grid format is no one reads past the grid anymore. They make it easier to fill out, but agents aren't reading past the grid, and they're relying on the TC. And the clients at the end of the transaction say, I paid all this money, and I never talked to the agent. The TC sent all the forms. The agents can't explain this anymore.
Between, one agent and another agent in the TC relationship, but
Yeah, depending on the TC. That's why I said the geek shall inherit the earth. The geeky agents that explain this, clients are going to be more inclined to pay you more for your value because you're the only agent that can explain this to them.
Would you say it would be wise and efficient that if they were going to go the traditional route, C1, C2, to just do a CBC right there?
So if someone's going the traditional route, C1 and C2, should the listing agent just send the CBC over up to the agent and the broker?
Have it on file, if you will, so that you can.
So talk to your office broker, manager, in-house counsel if they're okay with you having CBCs just all pre-signed, shotgunned out. You might be able to do that because the new CBC doesn't require management approval. If you're changing the offer compensation or there's no offer compensation, currently you need your office manager or broker to sign that CBC. The new one doesn't have that. Concerns me a little bit as an office manager, but that's an aside. Yeah.
So in the RLA, if C1 is selected, does not nullify the ability to get a CBC.
If C1 is selected, does it nullify the ability to give a CBC? No, because C1, that's
Only it's for seller side.
that's just the seller side.
Correct. So there's
Yes.
no money to be offered through a CBC to the buyer side.
Yes, if only C1 is checked.
Correct.
Yes.
That's what I'm asking.
Yes, if C2 is not
chosen-
checked,
Yeah.
correct. If the listing broker signs a CBC with the buyer's broker, they're giving up out of their pocket. They could.
That's the point I want to make.
They could. Yeah, no, it's a great point. Is that if, as a listing broker, you're going to offer compensation to a buyer's broker,
Coming out of your pocket.
yes, you need that C2 check and an amount
Yeah.
to be offered.
C2 on the
C2, yeah.
So I have a question on this one to solve the issue like with the first time home buyer. So, okay, so I'm making an offer on a property saying my client does not have the money to pay me commission. The seller is selling it, let's say $100,000 is the agreed price at that moment, and I had check mark that I don't have the money. Could the seller say, okay, I could now give you over the counter for $103,000, and so that $3,000 could be used for the buyer's commission to pay the buyer's broker.
So if I can try to recap the question without using actual numbers, if possible. Some of these are hard to do. So a first-time buyer, so a first-time buyer that cannot afford to pay their agent what they agreed to, writes in the offer, seller, you're going to pay me this amount. Can the seller pay them more? Was that?
No. So the seller upped the price of the whatever the agreement is. That way that they
So seller is
finance the
countering.
purchase amount.
Yeah, seller is
So that
countering.
$103,000
Raise the price,
finance.
and I will raise the amount I'm going to pay you to the buyer. So theoretically, yes, talk to the lender, make sure that the lender's okay with it.
Well, he has also say as long
Oh,
as
lenders have a say. Lenders absolutely have a say. Yeah.
purchase price.
Right. With the purchase price. It could be for that price. But also have your clients understand that property taxes are not just straight on the purchase price. They may start like that, but the tax assessor can assess it at whatever they think the actual price is. So with the concessions field on the back end that we have now, once you close it out and you say the seller paid the buyer this much for these different things, because we didn't touch on that, there's going to be different categories. Was this paid for commission? Was this paid for repairs? Was this paid to buy down the loan? Was this paid for Tyler and escrow? Tax assessors, appraisers, everyone will see that, and they'll be able to factor the actual effective price based on that. And that's mandatory that you have to add those in when you're closing it out. That's current now. So yes, it's negotiable, but there's caveats when people want to play with the purchase price for different reasons. You always need to be aware of why they're doing it and what's allowed and what's not, and what the reality is as far as lenders and taxes. Yeah.
Is this throughout the United States?
So yeah, NAR, the settlement terms affect all realtor members. So if you're a member of NAR, if you're a member of CAR, you're a member of NAR. If you're a member of a local board, you're a member of both. So if a licensee is not a member of NAR, the NAR rules don't apply. California is likely going to pass a law that says broker-buyer agreements cannot be any longer than 90 days or 3 months. That will probably go into effect in January as a law, but the new CAR forms are going to have that in a few weeks of that cap. The reason they're doing that is because that will affect all licensees in the state, where right now these new laws only bind realtor members, and CR is saying that's not fair to saddle some rules on NAR members and not have all licensees playing under the same rules. Okay, let me try to get through this part of the RLA. So this is part of getting in the weeds. So we have C1. We know that's the listing agent side. C2 is optional money the seller is paying the listing broker to offer to buyer's brokers. And that includes any other buyer's agent within the brokerage. That actually includes well, I won't go there yet, but that's the traditional way we're talking about. C3, CAR anticipates that buyers are going to come directly to the listing agent and say, I know that there's money on the table. I want to be unrepresented. So you lower the price, you lower the whatever, I get a benefit. And some listing agents say, I do a lot more work if the buyer's unrepresented. Now let's distinguish this from dual agency, whether single agency or otherwise. If that's the case, the seller and listing agent can talk at the time of the listing. If a buyer's unrepresented, seller, I expect to be paid a little bit more. Seller can say, yeah, I agree with you. Or they can say, no, we're not doing anything. But there's a line there to have this discussion with the seller of this very well may happen. C4, if the same individual agent represents both seller and buyer. So this is like the double ending, we call it, single agent, dual agency. The default is that you will get the total of C1 plus C2, because that's the listing side, and that's what's being offered to a buyer's agent out there. Or if a seller says, if you're doing both sides of the deal, I expect you to do it for a little bit less or more. Hey, I don't know. I'm optimistic. You can write, yeah, sure. You can write in that amount. But that takes into account for the likelihood that the listing agent is going to represent the buyer as well. And is that the same compensation or is that something different? And it should bring up the conversation about dual agency with your seller anyway. Are you okay with this? Seller may say, nope, I don't want you representing anyone else. Was there a hand? Yeah.
So I'm a listing agent and I don't work with buyers, but my son here does.
Mm-hmm.
And so is that the same because he's part of my team?
So you're the listing agent. You don't work with buyer's agents, but your son does who's on your team. Again, discussion with the seller. Are you okay with that? Seller may say, if it's on your team, son or otherwise, in my mind, that's the same thing. Or, like we know in California, dual agency is the entire brokerage. A seller may say, I don't want anyone in the brokerage representing the buyer. Some sellers say, I don't care if it's in the same brokerage. I just don't want you or a team member doing it, because if you have one number for single agent, dual agency, and that buyer's agent is going to be paid more, you're just going to pass it to your team member and say, now you're going to get more, and you may be defrauding your seller. You have a fiduciary duty to your seller, and who's really representing them. So this just brings up great talking points with your seller of all the things that could happen if who represents who, what are we willing to do?
I think what he's asking is if they're using C4, same individual agent, and his son was the buyer's agent, which mechanism, is it C2 or is it C4?
So in your question, if your son on your team represents the buyer, it would not fall under C4. That's individual agent, same licensee, same DRE number representing the buyer and seller. But if that's something that's a possibility, talk to your seller about that. Well, so if a team member represented the buyer, it would fall under C2 with the optional compensation to a buyer's agent. But I've seen many times where a seller says, if anyone on your team is representing the buyer, I'm considering that the same as you representing the buyer, because otherwise you're just going to funnel the deal to your team member to be paid more. Yeah. Okay, so C5 is a good example of my problem with cheat sheets, one sheets, flow charts, all of that. So CR tried to do it here for you all. Total compensation to brokers. A, the amount specified in C1 plus C2 if the buyer is represented, or B, the amount in C4 if the individual agent represents both sides, or the amount specified in C1 plus C3 if the buyer is unrepresented. Did that help anybody? No. You got to understand C1, C2, C3 anyway, otherwise that doesn't make sense. And if you understand that, you don't need the chart. Yeah. Question.
In C3 for unrepresented, I create a modification of terms. Do I need to put in the modifications that this other agent is going to get a referral of X percentage? Or do I just refer them?
You really plan on doing this, don't you?
I love lawyers until I have to be in front of them.
Yeah. Smart man. So I'm going to sidetrack. If I could do my life all over again, I'd probably gear myself as a kid to try and be an NFL punter. That just seems like the best job. Be an NFL player, no stress, whatever. I'm going to punt this one to your broker, your manager, your in-house counsel. Well, because it's very nuanced.
I know.
And it's very, fact specific of that case of what's happening with that particular buyer. So if that's fair, or we can talk afterwards.
We can talk after.
Yeah, because that's way, way down the rabbit hole. And I feel like this is an actual situation you're dealing with right now.
No, believe me, I've read all these forms and I've, gotten
Yeah.
into the weeds with this stuff.
Good. I love it.
question.
Oh, yes.
I know some agents are gonna probably do this. They probably wanna answer the C1, C2, C3 by putting a percentage on that. Can they do that?
Yeah, so can you put percentages in C1, C2, C3?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. That's
Or just put in one?
or just put in one. Yeah, I mean, you should at least have C1 because that's you getting paid. I definitely recommend that one. But yes, you could have different amounts for each of these depending on the circumstance. If the seller says, if this happens, I'll pay that. If that happens, I'll pay this. That's part of all of this, so you're addressing it now with the seller and agreeing to it versus when the offer comes in and now you're having to try to figure out and modify your listing agreement. Okay. C6, fortunately for all of us, this is the same as it was before. This is the protection period that after the cancellation or expiration of the listing for so many days, if these buyers buy it, I expect to be paid and represent you. Optional concessions, D. So this is what we talked about with CRMLS adding these fields tomorrow, is if the seller wants to offer concessions to the buyer, this is where this goes in. If the seller doesn't know what they want to offer, they don't want to offer any amount right now, you don't check the box, and it's just saying seller authorizes the broker to put in the MLS that seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions. If the seller knows how much they want to offer, you're going to check the box with check an amount up to blank percent or dollar amount. All right, so that on the listing agreement is all we have time for. And we didn't even have time for that. Let me hit a couple of the other forms that have changed. Good news, the SPBB, the seller paying buyer's broker. This is the one that in the offer, the buyer's asking the seller to pay the broker the difference. So again, you're the buyer's agent, buyer's committed to pay you X. Buyer's like, I don't want to pay out of pocket. Will you ask the seller to pay you instead? That's this form. The current one has 3 things to fill in that confuse everybody. They revised this just down to one thing to fill in. Simplified it. Seller agrees to pay buyer's broker blank. This. And because this form was misused more often than used correctly, because buyer's agents were using it to confirm compensation when they had no broker-buyer agreement signed, they added bold language, underlined, that says if there's no buyer representation agreement, then seller has no obligation to pay the buyer's broker. This form is invalid. You didn't use it right. Why are you using this form if there's no broker-buyer agreement? So for this form to be valid, buyer's agent has to have a broker-buyer agreement signed, and there has to be, the amount paid is not entirely offset. So if your buyer's committed to pay you X, and your CBC says the seller's broker is paying you X, they match, you don't use this form, buyer's not paying out of pocket. So this is only if the buyer has some remainder left over. Let's talk about open houses, because that was a big question when we did this last. Does the broker-buyer mandate apply to listing agents holding an open house? Broker-buyer mandate does not apply to open houses. Buyer walks in as a listing agent, you can have them sign nothing, you can have them sign or give them an open house visitor non-agency, says, I work for the seller, I don't work for you. Anything you tell me is not confidential. I work for the seller. Any communication we have is for the benefit of the seller. I don't work for you. If you want to hire me, you can hire me. CAR came out with another form you'll see that no one is ever going to use. The Limited Property Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement for use by agents holding an open house or another agent giving a prospective purchaser a tour. It's like a mini broker-buyer agreement that says, buyer, you're going to commit to me if you buy the property at the top of the page or these two other ones. Why would you use this? Just use a broker-buyer agreement. I don't know. There's got to be some good reason for this form. If you guys can the acronym, oh, you're going to make me do this. It's not an acronym. It's an initialism. An acronym says the word, like scuba, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, sonar. Initialisms, you just say the letters. Okay, California Association of Realtors, initialism or acronym? Both. You can say CAR or CAR. You say it both. Okay, sorry, you made me do it. The LPRBC. I told you, the geek are going to inherit the earth. Oh, the OHNA-SI. Oh, oh no, there's more forms. Okay, well, no. So yeah, this is the OHNA-SI, and this could be good because it has the visitor's name and email. So you capture their stuff, and sellers probably say, oh, up, down, where do you want to go?
What is the initialism?
Oh, OHNA-SI, open house, non-agency, sign-in.
So they can't walk into the open house until they fill this out.
No, that's not true.
No, not necessarily. Now, your seller may say, I require everyone coming in to sign in. That's up to the seller. But NAR rules don't make you do anything. They can just come in. You don't have to have them sign anything to come into an open house.
Can I tell them the price of the house then and give them information?
Yes. So you can show them around. You can give them information because you are acting on behalf of the seller. And that's why this says, agent doesn't represent the visitor. Any communication with the agent at the open house is for the benefit of the seller. I can tell you all about the property. I don't work for you. Now, Code of Ethics says you can't lie to people, can't misrepresent. Hopefully we know that. But you are working for the seller. And that's the reason why NAR and attorneys say the broker-buyer mandate does not apply to open houses. You're working for the seller. Now, as a side note, I don't recommend ever doing an open house for another broker. Most brokerages do not allow agents to hold open houses for other brokers. DRE says it's kind of a gray area. You can, you might not want to. In that case, though, not only may insurance may not cover you, if you're holding an open house for another broker and a buyer walks in, you might have to have them sign a broker-buyer agreement because you're not working for the seller. You're not the broker for the seller. So, easy thing, don't hold open houses for other brokers. Your insurance may not cover you. What? I'm sorry?
If someone did do that, if an agent did do that, would you
If an agent did that, you might use this, yes, because it's the limited property representation. Oh, so that's maybe the reason why Sierra came up with this form. All right. I'm learning as much as you guys. Yeah.
So would it be a good idea to use this form if I'm the listing agent but another outside broker wants to hold that open house, we could require that to be signed?
So if you're the listing agent and you have another broker
Brokerage.
sign, now whatever their broker requires may be on them. But again, are you an independent broker or you work for brokerage?
No, CB.
Okay, so talk to Rick Hernandez.
Yeah.
Talk to Rick about that. Again, punt. I'm punting to Rick on this one. And I'm telling Rick too, if you don't come talk to Rick, he's going to find you.
He knows I know.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to leave that one alone. Okay, the buyer identification of preferences and priorities. You may use this with buyers at your buyer consultation because there's no real form right now that says, hey, buyer, what are you looking for? What's your price range? Is this your primary residence? Do you want a single family? How many bed, bath, square footage? I don't know what you're looking for. Tell me so I can narrow it down so I'm not wasting my time or your time. So you have the BIP, the BIPP. This is bonus. Nothing to do with the new NAR stuff, but I mentioned this, the security deposit law that goes into effect July 1st. There is a form if the seller believes they are exempt from the new law. So landlords can only get 1 month security deposit starting July 1st and after, except if the landlord is a small landlord. Like Gov Hutchinson says, has nothing to do with height or weight. It has to do with the number of units they own. If a landlord owns a total of 2 properties or less, or a total of 4 units or less, they are exempt from the new law. They can still charge 2 times the monthly rent for unfurnished, 3 times the monthly rent for fully furnished. However, California law loves exceptions to exemptions. If the tenant is an armed service member, doesn't matter how many units the landlord owns, they can only be charged 1 month's rent, and they would fill this out. They're an active member and what branch they're from, and we thank them for their service. Okay.
What if the owner buys each individual property in an LLC or trust?
I love this question. What if an owner buys multiple properties, buys one in their name, and their spouse buys another, and they put another in their trust, and they put another in an LLC? Law's not clear on that. One of my favorite lines from Gov Hutchinson, CR's attorney Gov Hutchinson, one of my favorite lines is he goes, "Try it, let's see if you get sued, come back and tell us how that works." Because we don't know. It's unclear. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. One last one. Sorry, one last one. I'm a sucker for questions. I love it.
LA as well as Orange County?
Yeah, all of California. This new law is all of California. Yeah, if you're doing rentals in LA, God help you. That's, yep. Oh. No more than 2 rental properties or a total of 4 units. Whether that's in the state, nationwide, worldwide, we're not really sure. Again, it's a new law, and no, does not include primary residence. So my agents know my simple answer to this is always, don't do rentals. They suck. Just refer them out to anyone else.